Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and introduce Professor Goldman. Like many of us, like many of the people I see around here, she's both a poet and a scholar of Virginia Woolf. She's edited a lot of Virginia Woolf's work for the Cambridge edition of Woolf, and she has several published volumes of poetry. And since everything that literary activism does is really a conversation between writing and criticism, it's a absolutely appropriate kind of session. So.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? First of all, thank you, Ami, for introducing me to this wonderful group of writers, critics, poets, scholars. I think we're all united in one thing. We love, as Gertrude Stein says, anything a word can do. And I really enjoyed listening to the first paper today, and you're going to love my citational paper, I hope. But I would say that what I'm doing in my paper is citationality as sociality. Okay, so to begin with, I have this quotation from To the Lighthouse, which many of you may well recognize. Her husband spoke. He was repeating something, and she knew it was poetry from the rhythm and the ring of exultation and melancholy in his voice. Come out and climb the garden path, Luriana, Luri Lee. The China rose is all abloom and buzzing with the yellow bee. The words, she was looking at the window, sounded as if they were floating like flowers on water out there, cut off from them all, as if no one had said them, but they had come into existence of themselves. And all the lives we ever lived and all the lives to be are full of trees and changing leaves. She did not know what they meant, but, like music, the words seemed to be spoken by her own voice, outside herself, saying quite easily and naturally what had been in her mind the whole evening, while she said different things. She knew, without looking round, that everyone at the table was listening to the voice saying, I wonder if it seems to you, Luriana, Luri Lee, with the same sort of relief and pleasure that she had, as if this were, at last, the natural thing to say. This were their own voice speaking. But the voice had stopped. She looked round. She made herself get up. Augustus Carmichael had risen, and holding his table napkin so that it looked like a long white robe, he stood chanting. To see the kings go riding by over lawn and daisy lea, with their palm leaves and cedar, Luriana, Luri Lee. And as she passed him, he turned slightly towards her, repeating the last words, Luriana, Luri Lee, and bowed to her as if he did her homage. Without knowing why, she felt that he liked her better than he had ever done before. And with a feeling of relief and gratitude, she returned his bow and passed through the door, which he held open for her. It was necessary now to carry everything a step further. With her foot on the threshold, she waited a moment longer in a scene which was vanishing, even as she looked. And then, as she moved and took Minter's arm and left the room, it changed. It shaped itself differently. It had become, she knew, giving one last look at it over her shoulder, already the past. Okay, so this paper, I'm going to keep returning to this passage into the Lighthouse. I don't know what the etiquette is, but we're encouraged to give trigger warnings and content warnings where I come from. And I would just like to warn you that I am going to use some very rude bawdy language at points in this, but also more problematic, I'm going to quote a black author using a derogatory term for black people. When I'm quoting from him, I will quote him. But when I'm referring to that word again, I will not utter it. And I hope that that is an etiquette that you can live with. But I thought I should point that out. So what follows, I will gladly give this paper to everybody to read. Just email me and I'll make it available. So if you just listen now, you can see the kind of form it's written on. The rest of the paper is in this form. An academic philosopher is on his holidays in the Hebrides in a novel published in 1927, overheard by his wife reciting a postprandial poem on the terrace, a song taken up on the opium-stained lips of the poet rising from table, to chant it, forging a phatic lyric continuum or circulating affect between scholar and creative practitioner in an era when university professionals were often mere misters like Mr. Ramsay, rarely Mrs. like Miss Jane Harrison, not so many doctors, in a phatic lyric continuum that is patriarchal and already the past, as even the scholar's patriarchal wife herself knows, she being always already designated object of the song, its Luriana, Lurili, never its composer, yet recognizing its power to seem to be the natural thing to say. And later she finds herself murmuring it as pondering her husband's worrying about his books. Would they be read? She drops her own knitting, lured by Luriana to read line 1 of the Siren's Song by William Brown of Tavistock. Steer hither, steer your winged pines, all beaten mariners. The scene perhaps speaks to Amit Chowdhury's provoking nostalgia for pre-Lapsarian days prior to the bifurcation of pedagogy in the 80s, a steer hither that left creative writers as crafters and academics as prose or prosy professional critics. His words floating like flowers on water, luring us to manufacture a consent of sorts. I want somehow to resist it, sans resort to deadly unmasking hermeneutics of suspicion, sans resort to reductive unmasking or paranoid reading, preferring erring into the accretive mode of Eve Sedgwick's reparative reading, itself a reparative making derived from Melanie Klein's model of a depressive position, the desire of a reparative impulse being additive and accretive, going in fear that the culture surrounding it is inadequate or inimical to its nurture. It wants to assemble and confer plenitude on an object that will then have resources to offer to an inchoate self, hence classic camp performance as startlingly juicy displays of excess erudition, passionate, often hilarious antiquarianism, prodigal production of alternate historiographies, over-attachment to fragmentary marginal waste, or leftover products, rich, highly interruptive, affective variety, irrepressible fascination with ventriloquistic experimentation, disorienting juxtapositions of present with past, popular with high culture, additive and accretive, taking the terror out of error, as Joe Litvak wrote to Sedgwick. And what is more additive and accretive than the flowers floating in water of Mrs. Ramsay's simile? Call the flowers poetry, the water readers or critics or translators, or call the flowers subjectile, the water substrate. It's Woolf's simile too, although here she is teasing us with superb intertextuality. To begin with, there is Luriana Luri Lee, the poem that finds itself published for the very first time in the pages of To the Lighthouse, in fragments and snatches, in an act we might recognize as lyric activism, as if they were floating like flowers on water out there, cut off from them all, as if no one had said them, but they had come into existence of themselves, as if Woolf herself had composed them. But she had not. She had transcribed them from her husband's recital, Leonard Woolf having heard them from Lytton Strachey's recital, the words being composed one night and recited at breakfast by his relation, Charles Elton, classical scholar, 1839 to 1900. The poem never published in entirety until Vita Sackville West had it anthologized in 1945, having heard it from her lover, Virginia Woolf. I have been in correspondence for 20 years with a Dr. John Shaw, who took up literary studies when he retired as GP. Sometime before that, he's a wonderful instance of Mrs. Woolf's and Dr. Johnson's common reader, who on learning of my editorship of To the Lighthouse has been keen for me to enshrine in the explanatory notes reference to his thoroughgoing monograph, The Quest for Luriana, the story of a Bloomsbury poem, itself published by Cecil Woolf, himself the nephew of Leonard Woolf, which I'm glad to do, Shaw's scholarship being a form of lyric activism that makes Woolf's word flowers floating on water bloom, unfurl, flourish further, with the story of the poem's oral, handwritten and print transmission and likely location of Elton's garden, the rose bushes therein, and possible original identity of Elton's Luriana, and contexts in which various Bloomsbury members recited the poem to each other. This poem that unites poet Augustus Carmichael, academic Mr. Ramsay, untutored Mrs. Ramsay, in dispersed collective utterance. And now you and me here today in Delhi. 2 years ago, John Shaw, on entering a care home, sent me his Luriana archive, an enormous box containing several colour-coded ring binder folders of archival notes, painstakingly ordered in hope I might be able to make use of them in the Cambridge edition and also find an archive to house them. Alas, no archive is willing yet. The folders speak to the accrual of feeling, as Woolf said of The Lighthouse, meaning nothing by it, but a central line down the book's middle to hold the design together, seeing all sorts of feelings would accrue to this, but refusing to think them out, trusting people would make it the deposit of their own emotions. Yes, accrual of feeling for Luriana, a deposit for a poetic scholarly community across generations of writers, critics, scholars, academics, and common readers. Indeed, I was moved to find there letters to Leonard Woolf inquiring about Luriana from Professor Wallace Robson, who taught me modern literature and literary theory at Edinburgh University, an eminent critic and author of The Definition of Literature, 1982, and A Prologue to English Literature, 1986. And Wallace Robson was a poet too, I quote, "That feeling, panther in me, pad pad, puss puss, a secluded, purring, a pacing, pausing, springs and roars, and in the eyes, calm. How lovely to read Wallace's letter to Lady Elton, feeling a fraud merely to fill a little gap in a literary history he was writing in 1973, supposing Luriana a wild flower, and Elton's other work, had it survived, not so good. It sounds, he says, like a case of sheer inspiration, boasting to her of his friendship with poet Robert Graves, who claimed a poet's blessing when a baby in his pram from the eccentric Mr. Swinburne, who claimed he had had the blessing from Landor, who in turn had it from Dr. Johnson. So Wallace got Graves to transmit the blessing to his own son Hugh, then aged 1 and now aged 8. But so far, he reports, it has not fructified. I googled it, he's not become a poet. I like to think there's a poet panther caged in every literary critic, and there's poetry in criticism, criticism in poetry, yet Amit's bifurcation pretends criticism is written in the language of information, which is everything poetry is not. Yet theory teaches us philosophy is poetry too, and I do not recognize a difference between my writing as a critic and as a poet. It's all writing, but different genres. And with Stein, I love anything that a word can do, and Woolf understands the reader to be the writer's fellow worker and accomplice. The quickest way, she says, to understand what a novelist is doing is not to read, but to write, to make your own experiment with the dangers and difficulties of words. How I wish critics like Rita Felsky would act on this. And the time to read poetry, says Woolf, is when we are most able to write it. And here, writing engenders a kind of busy and attentive piece I'd call otium. It's counter to what Bernard Stiegler identifies as neg-otium. That is an economy which is internalizable via an accounting of what is calculable for a businessman and negotiable on a market, all sense of measure being reduced to this calculation. But now John Shaw, at 90 years old, has requested return of his archive as he is keen to start new projects. John Shaw has more to discover and write about Luriana Lurie-Lee. In this pursuit, he is clearly a true practitioner of otium, a busy, productive kind of idleness off the clock of state time, the kind of louche, decorative idleness, the figure of flowers floating on water that Woolf floats before us. Her reader playfully signify themselves pulpy with citationality or multivalent intertextuality, pulpy like the fragments of Sappho pulled or dismounted from the cartonnage of masks of ancient Egyptian mummies, or pulled from the cartonnage of dusty grammarians, works or critical commentaries. And Woolf would know, like Elton would know, Sappho's rose and Sappho's bee. And as for Woolf's contemporaries, Ezra Pound prefers in Papyrus to keep Sappho fragment 81 as dry pellet. I quote the poem in its entirety: Papyrus, spring, too long, gongular. Whereas HD soaks Sappho fragment 101 until it swims in stanzas of dripping honey. I quote HD. Not honey, not the plunder of the bee from meadow or sandflower or mountain bush, from winter flower or shoot, born of the later heat. Not honey, nor the sweet stain on the lips and teeth. Not honey, not the deep plunge of soft belly and the clinging of the gold-edged pollen-dusted feet. Not so, though rapture blind my eyes and hunger crisp, dark and inert my mouth. Not honey, not the south, not the tall stalk of red twin lilies, nor light branch of fruit tree caught inflexible light branch. Not honey, not the south, flower of purple iris, flower of white, or of the iris, withering covering the grass, for fleck of the sun's fire gathers such heat and power that shadow print is light cast through the petals of the yellow iris flower. Not iris, old desire, old passion, old forgetfulness, old pain, not this, not any flower, but if you turn again, seek strength of arm and throat, touch as the god, neglect the lyre note, knowing that you shall feel about the frame, no trembling of the string, but heat more passionate of bone, and the white shell and fiery temple steel. Is Pound's Sappho paranoid? Is H.D.'s Sappho reparative? A poem unfurling as it does, like Woolf's word flowers floating on water, and Woolf's words floating like flowers on water are themselves also pulpy with their own floating trope, as my colleague John Coyle in a beautifully turned essay called Pulp Fiction has uncoiled in Woolf's Jacob's Room and Joyce's Ulysses, and before these Proust's Swan's Way. But I would also uncoil here Jean Toomer's Cain, published the year after Jacob's Room and Ulysses and 10 years after Proust. So let's listen to the pulpy flower heads lopped from these texts. This is Jacob's Room. About this time, a firm of merchants having dealings with the East put on the market little paper flowers which opened on touching water. As it was the custom also to use finger bowls at the end of dinner, the new discovery was found of excellent service. In these sheltered lakes, the little coloured flowers swam and slid, surmounted smooth, slippery waves, and sometimes foundered and lay like pebbles on the glass floor. Their fortunes were watched by eyes intent and lovely. It is surely a great discovery that leads to the union of hearts, the foundation of homes. The paper flowers did no less. Here is Ulysses. I see a Chinese one time, related the doughty narrator, that had little pills like putty, and he put them in the water and they opened, and every pill was something different. One was a ship, another was a house, another was a flower. Cooks rats in your soup, he appetizingly added. The Chinese does. And here's Swan's Way in translation. And as in the game wherein the Japanese amuse themselves by filling a porcelain bowl with water and steeping it in little pieces of paper, which until then are without character and form, but the moment they become wet, stretch and twist and take on colour and distinctive shape, become flowers or houses or people, solid and recognisable, so that in that moment all the flowers in our garden and in Monsieur Swan's park and the water lilies on the Vivant and the good folk of the village and their little dwellings and the parish church and the whole of Combray and its surroundings, taking shape and solidity, sprang into being, town and gardens alike, from my cup of tea. So now to Jean Toomer's Cain of 1923. One thing about him goes straight to the heart. He has an Adam's apple, which strains sometimes as if he were painfully gulping great globules of air floating, shredded life pulp. It is a sad thing to see a banty-bowed, shaky, ricket-legged man straining the raw insides of his throat against smooth air, holding furtive thoughts about the glory of pulp heads strewn in water. He is way down, mud coming to his banty knees, almost hides them. Some people will be looking at him and calling him a strong man. No doubt he is, for one, who has had rickets. Let's give it to him let's call him great when the water shall have been all drawn off. Let's build a monument and set it in the ooze where he goes down, a monument of hewn oak carved in niggerheads. Let's open our throats, brother, and sing Deep River when he goes down. Brother, Robert is sinking. Let's open our throats, brother. Let's sing Deep River when he goes down. But does it seem too forced to align the little paper flowers which opened on touching water and the pills like putty and steeping little pieces of paper with pulp heads strewn in the water, pulp heads also signifying cigarette or cigar butts, commonly referenced by the racists as N-heads? Toomer's lacerating lyric prose itself insists the explicitly abject unfurling of an Orientalist trope of conspicuous commodity consumption by the leisured classes, a visceral elegy of sorts to the palpable human cost, the hard-labouring bodies, the maimed, crippled and snuffed-out bodies underpinning it, an unfurling that catches everything between a discarded cigarette butt and the Zong massacre. Is it too forced to find Woolf's words floating like flowers on water, to be holding to Toomer's gorgeous furtive thoughts about the glory of pulpheads strewn in water? Perhaps not so forced at all if we turn to Woolf's manuscript notebook To the Lighthouse, where Toomer is listed among the names to be used in her new novel, and we find she and he published in The Dial in 1923, that she and Leonard owned a presentation copy of Alan Locke's New Negro, in which Toomer's Cain poetry also appears. And yes, they had a copy of Du Bois' Souls of Black Folks too. And reading Cain, we discover another overbearing and racist Mr. Ramsay, and therefore another glaring, powerful intertext between Toomer and Woolf that went unremarked on until my article in 2009, Had There Been an Axe Handy, Transatlantic Modernism, Virginia Woolf and Jean Toomer, and mostly unremarked on since that article by modernist and Woolf scholars. And where did I get the nous to think of Toomer and Woolf in the same sentence, aside from her own notes? Her own notes for the novel. Certainly not from Wallace Robson's prologue to English literature, but at Edinburgh, I was also taught by the amazing scholar Paul Edwards, renowned expert on slave narrative and editor of Equiano's interesting narrative, as well as translator of Icelandic sagas with Herman Poulsen. Their poem translation of Havamal is superb. Paul Edwards taught me the structuring significance of Black aesthetics and slave narrative in the history of the novel, and in his office, an open house of otium, I would argue, serving wine and beer and erudite and bawdy chat every afternoon. I met distinguished writers and scholars such as novelist Carol Phillips and poet-scholar David Daberdeen. So of course I recognize Ulaudo Equiano's feeling for snow in Woolf's intriguing pointed reference in her novel The Years of 1937 to, I quote, "A Negro laughing aloud in the snow. In the snow," said Martin, "a Negro." And my hearing in Woolf's text Equiano's wonder at fall of snow on arrival in England has since been supplemented not by another professional academic Woolf critic or textual editor, but by the novelist Schola von Reinhold in their novel Lot of 2020, a prize-winning work about queer Black trans woman trapped in the archive of an art residency, and itself a paean to the louche idleness of otium. This novel on a lotus-eating cult, replete with pages from the fictitious critical work Black Modernisms, which von Reinhold has since been actually commissioned to write. But have they already written it, in fact, in this novel that also includes direct citation of my essay on Woolf and Toomer? And no surprise, given von Reinhold's a scholarship-funded graduate of Glasgow's Lit in creative writing, and took as part of that degree my Lit-Crit module, Virginia Woolf Writes Modernity, the only module I teach now at Glasgow not listed as creative writing, but which nevertheless is creative writing. Lote also offers further illumination of the snow scene conjured in the years when the narrator discovers, this is von Reinhold, the diary of a Moorish courtier of James IV. I read a little. November 1589. Several other blackamoors had attended the Scottish king's wedding in Norway, some as guests like the diarist, and some as musicians and dancers. As the king's wish, a few had danced in the snow, almost naked, because he thought the sight of their bodies against the white would look splendid. They all perished of pneumonia. The next night, the king, who had already commended the diarist's legs, visited his bed and revisited the praise. The story is true, just Google it. How beautifully, how shockingly it floats up for Lote's reader, like word flowers on water, or like pulp heads strewn in water, a trope troping, and Lote also floats up in the embedded story of Hermia, one of the Hermetic protagonist's many inchoate selves, aka the Black Princess in the Sybaritic Scarlet Room, that very trope of flowers floating of pulp heads strewn on and in water. Another quote from Lote. She observed that the panelled passageway to the room was strung with garlands, a mild prelude, for she threw open the door and saw the room was furiously wreathed, bowls of hyacinth everywhere, lilies in pots of crushed ice, orchid heads floating in the fountain. A miniature replica of the one above, posies of amaranth, lavender, violet, florets of aromatic flowering herb. Early on, there's a brief chronology of unfurling when the narrator recounts the spiraling experience of being dead-named, resulting in full autobiographical collapse on the train, darling. We've all experienced it, I think. Then the narrative proceeds in a process of furling, folding, convoluting ontologies of selves in process or on trial, as Kristeva has it, selves in need of fountains to float in, as if they had come into existence of themselves. Von Reinhold's fountain-floating orchids are pulpy with Proust and Woolf and Joyce and Toomer too. Lote is now set reading on 1B, the novel and narratology, our first year spring module. This is the list. Shelley's Frankenstein, Bronte's Jane Eyre, Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Virginia Woolf's Orlando, Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, and finally Schola von Reinhold's Lote. Von Reinhold's current autobiography reads, Schola von Reinhold was abandoned as a baby in Père Lachaise Cemetery in 1965 before going on to reside at the Château de Mélande after being taken in the last of Josephine Baker's infamous Rainbow Children. After a disastrous audition at the Bolshoi Ballet Company, they went on to complete a master's in creative writing at Glasgow University. Lote, their debut novel, was published in 2020. And awarded the same award as Amit, the James Tate Black Memorial Award. Shola, yes, Low was partly written on a Glasgow MLit taught by creative writing staff, most of whom have doctorates, either in creative writing or lit-crit poets, Colin Hurd, Sophie Collins, Nikki Melville, and myself, and prosers, Elizabeth Reader, Zoe Strachan, and Caroline Jess Cook. But our most recent appointee, Kerry Hudson, author of the amazing memoir Lowborn, bucks that trend, as does Professor Louise Welsh, crime novelist, sans doctorate, but a graduate of our MLit from the era of the founding triumvirate chair of 2001, occupied by Tom Leonard, Alistair Gray, and James Kelman, all three great public intellectuals outside the academy, the latter two gone from it by the time I got my readership at Glasgow in 2007, the year after I came out as a poet, leaving Dundee just as I got my way with the establishment of creative writing, and Kirsty Gunn inaugurated as founding professor of what she rightly prefers to call writing practice and study. After which I worked closely at Glasgow with Tom Leonard under his tutelage as a poet, co-teaching poetry and poetics and literary theory with him in seminars and lectures meanwhile. I've collaborated with von Reinhold on Writer's Shift, a residency which the Fruit Market Gallery, Edinburgh, in which 5 poets plus von Reinhold explored nearly 50 years of gallery history via the archives. And in my suite of poems for that project, I find it hard to find evidence of Amit's 80s bifurcation, which in the UK at least was surpassed in the 90s after the RAE, now REF, Research Excellence Framework audit recognised creative writing as professional scholarly output. Overnight, creative writers moved from the side cupboard confessional of solitary writer in residence to multiple permanent academic appointments, and creative writing properly entered the curriculum in numerous institutions, transforming English literature departments previously split by the theory wars. And over 2 decades on, I find different kinds of schisms. Yes, there are still die-hard crafter-style Iowa workshop-inspired creative writers, and there are still self-hating literary critics who would rather die than attempt to assign a mark to a student's poem or flash fiction. There are still, in some institutions, writers who take their own success in the marketplace as the measure of what counts in the academy, and students who flock to their feet in vain hope of being discovered for that market. I'm a scholar first inducted into the academy as literary critic, but now researcher and teacher by creative practice. I'm often shot at by both these conservative sides, inducing my own full autobiographical collapse on the train, darling. I won't answer to writer or critic, preferring poet and Woolf person. And certainly I've found my tribes on campus and off campus, and certainly when I ran for 8 years the now legendary 1A Poetry and Poetics, our flagship first-year module until 2018, I made sure most of our tutors were poets. And if they were not, when they started, like the students, they were most of them poets by the end of the course. My graduate teaching team included these poets: Callie Gardner, Nat Raha, Leela Matsumoto, Tom Betteridge, Katie Hasty, Callum Roger, Sophie Collins, Nuala Watt, Nikki Melville. They taught poetry in terms of literary theory, literary criticism, and creative practice, and lectures were more often given over to readings by invited poets such as Tom Leonard, Peter Manson, J.L. Williams, Colin Hurd, Kai Miller, and the poet tutors themselves, as well as open mic sessions for the students. I now teach the undergraduate honours modules, creative writing poetry, poetry mothers, queer poems, queer poetics. And the MLit module I designed with poet Colin Hurd and co-teach with poet Maria Sledmere, poetry intervenes now, diverse queer strategies of making. All with hefty reading lists in poetry and lit crit and lit theory and many other kinds of media. My pedagogy is based in avant-garde experimental poetics, Dada, Ulipu, ritual erasure, redaction, aleatory digital procedures, poets' theatre, site-specific work, assemblages, ekphrasis, and SEKXPHRASTIKS. SEKXPHRASTIKS being the title of my first poetry collection. I had wanted to close by segueing to my poem translations of Catullus, which arose from textual editing, and my discovering citations of snatches of Catullus, Sappho, Ovid, and Tibullus, floating up from the text of To the Lighthouse. But now I'm more minded to close after a wee drop of Catullus with samples of work by my students on Poetry Mothers. These too are translations of a sort, but I want to ask, are they the fruits of otium, or are they the fruits of negotium? These poems by student poets, many so heavily in debt and choosing between heating and eating, while spending more time serving in Tesco's or McDonald's or Pizza Hut than they can reading or idling in the library. And I'm reduced to being raw content provider for these units of academic debt, is sometimes what I think. Yet in our seminars and workshops, something else is happening here. And 2,000 years ago, Catullus 51 knows what it is. So here's my translation of Catullus 51, which is in turn translating a bit of Sappho. He to me is a pure God. He can probably be all gods, the lad sitting right in your face, watching you and hearing you, you gently laughing, which rips all the feelings out of me, sad fucker. For as soon as I see you, Lesbia, nothing is on my tongue, but it stiffens, and a searing fire runs right through me. Both ears ring themselves deaf, and my eyes turn midnight. Otium, Catullus, has done you in. Otium blisses you out. You overdo otium, and it did in kings before you, ruined rich cities. I have resisted Englishing Catullus's otium here, whereas Ovid's otium in Amores 2, line 730, I have Englished as free cunt time. It's his art of love or joy of sex, after all. What English word would do here, though, in Catullus 51? Peace, idleness, fecklessness, ease, pleasure, sex, looseness, debauchery, other shades of otium, then these are also present, not just energetic love-making, but overzealous poetry-making. Even Ovid calls his poems otia, the fruits of otium. Here, I understand Catullus's otium as poetry making, and poetry making as criticism, and poetry making as theory, and poetry making as textual editing, and poetry making as translation, all of which are present in this lyric spasm on otium itself. This virtuosic piece of lyric work follows on from, accretes to a carefully worked translation of Sappho 31, and Catullus's reparative coda to Sappho evidences the all-consuming demands of translation, of editing, of theorizing, of criticism, as all as poetry itself, and it's surely a comment too on poetry's revolutionary political potential. However we English it, we need to be alive to the political power of otium. It has the capacity to bring down kings, destroy cities. Indeed, the ruling classes for centuries have been troubled at the prospect of the lower orders having too much otium. soldiers and citizens with too much otium are not merely close to opting out of, rather than merely taking a break from war and business, i.e. negotium, they may bring it all down, and not simply out of debauched dereliction of duty. They may throw their energies into organizing opposition. They may be busy hatching all-consuming countercultures. All I'm saying is, brothers, sisters, we don't need that fascist groove thang. All I am saying is give otium a chance. And now I would like to just close with some samples of work by my students, many of whom have gone on to be published poets, from Poetry Mother's Queer Poems, Queer Poetics. The course, Poetry Mothers, is a noun phrase and a declarative sentence, taking as axiomatic the work of queer theorist and poet Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. Poetry Mothers investigates alternative ways of thinking, reading, and writing back through our poetic mother texts in modes of mothering and unmothering. Seminars closely examine 3 mother texts, Audre Lorde's Your Silence Will Not Protect You, Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, and Emily Dickinson's Envelope Poems, inviting creative critical responses in workshops. Students also seek out and engage with other mother texts and collaborate in the critiquing and making of new queer mother texts, simultaneously forging a community of poets dedicated to queer making and queer making. Each year, 2 guest poets read to the class, for example, Maggie O'Sullivan, Nat Raha, C.A. Conrad, Leela Matsumoto. Here is a collaborative piece that the 2019 Poetry Mothers made in response to Dickinson's Envelope Poems. I'll just scroll to the end of my paper. These are poems, in case you don't know, in Dickinson's archive, where she penciled onto scraps and fragments of used mail envelopes, carefully slitting them into various shapes, then fitted the words of each poem to the morphology of the envelope. These 52 works, which are objects spanning poetry and visual art, were published for the first time in the 21st century in a colour facsimile edition, The Gorgeous Nothings. Some poets used small envelopes in my class, others chose other objects they understood as envelopes, including packaging for HIV PrEP and contraceptives, an antidepressant container, an orange peel, and a binder vest. They collaborated in arranging them as you see, and then we had a collective reading from the body of the work. I'll just read 3 of them now to give you a sense of their work. I've no idea if I'm on time or not, but I have a phrase, who the Catullus is counting, you know. Counting is bad faith, so, you know.
Maybe 2 or 3 minutes more?
It's perfectly timed. This is the end, don't worry. Okay. So that's the assembled poem by the class, and here are, you know, I've zoomed in on 3. This is the orange peel envelope poem by Audrey Q. Kendall. Sweet baby, parturition from sweet membrane, no way to be opened, but torn. This is a window pane envelope poem by Rosa Cass Simpson. I love your open hole, pinkish shell, let me hide, clear wrapper between your folds, caressed in thick skin, spread my pale red out, cut the lining on the line, deliver each edge, make soft and smooth, open where I fall out. And finally, the binder envelope poem Obviously, these transcriptions are doing violence to the original poem, as is the photograph, but it's the nearest we can get. Binder envelope poem by Mickey Benson. Bloom, pop, bloom, pop. The restriction is learned young. My grandmother was told love was crinkled, safety, crumpled away. 3 years old in a tenancy. Hushed voices simmer like seeds in March. If her baby bird voice cried loud enough to unravel the paint, someone would consider coming. Her father's broad shoulders hunched over, tired. Her Kashka-fed family, tired. Kashka's a raw, old world grain, who unopened barely blossoms, loud and salty, nothing like buttered popcorn, flashy, unfilling, explosive, bursts like anger when quiet goes stale. So we will. I fear, I know, I am, I look just like her. This doesn't hide it, the baby bird voice. And her note to the poem. My poem envelops my body. I feel that my need for it to not take up space and be known must, in fact, do both. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Goldman, for a genuinely genre-bending paper that sort of brings together poetry, of course, but editorial and archival work as well, and most of all, intellectual autobiographies. You know, we've got about 10 minutes, so please let's have some questions. Yeah. Amit, please.
Thank you. That was really inspirational. If I can use that word. I should move to Glasgow, I think.
Please come. We'd love you.
Thank you. Just a few observations from, not a question really, but observations to which you can respond, maybe. I mean, from my vantage point, I became aware that there were others like me in the sense that there were writers who were engaging with philosophy and theory without embarrassment. When I met them in 2005 at this conference organized by UEA, when I didn't work there, where I first met Dubravka, and she was one of those people. And it seemed to me that maybe this hostility to thought is an Anglophone thing, but maybe it's narrower than Anglophone, within the Anglophone, or maybe you're not Anglophone, or you know, I mean, you fall within a construction for me that from that time that lies outside the Anglophone, as I was kind of comprehending it, understanding it. I found people at ease with thought, but outside of the Anglophone writers. So I'm talking about the Arab writers, I'm talking about the Latvian writers, I'm talking about et cetera, you know. Then I think I wonder about this. The poetic provenances of a lot of theory, of a great deal of theory, and the way those poetic provenances are seen and kept in mind in poetry workshops, at least at UEA. But the way they've been lost in the literature departments.
I agree.
Where those ambiguous provenances, once theory was appropriated by the Anglo-American Academy, I think they were lost greatly, and it became a much more punitive discourse. And so I began to teach a seminar called the creative and critical PhD at UEA. And I noticed that, again, they were very at ease talking about creative process, philosophy, theory, and criticism. And I thought, is it because they're PhD students? Then I realized that most of the people in that seminar were poets. So that's the other thing, poets. The moment that seminar, I was absent for a couple, I asked somebody to take over the seminar, came back, found it had been taken over by the novelists. But the novelists had a very different view. I mean, they wanted more of the feedback stuff. You know, they wanted to know whether the sentences were working or the characters were working. And so gradually, in that kind of setup, creative writing was moving towards a different model for pedagogy, which might become a very powerful model, self-assessment. That you know, students really assess each other. The teacher becomes facilitator of that assessment. But so I'm wondering about all these historical shifts contained within these experiences, starting from 2005, an encounter with the non-Anglophone. What happens to theory when it goes into the literature department via Anglo-America, and poets and theory, poets and criticism, in contrast to a certain kind of novelist who has dominated, and their relationship to theory, thought, and criticism.
Thank you. Those are very on-point comments. First of all, at Glasgow, I'm boasting about my own institution. I think our English department, adjacent to its Scottish literature as well, that Glasgow does really well all three aspects of the study of English, in the sense of literary criticism, and it still has close reading practitioners of that. Literary theory, my esteemed colleague Vasiliki Kolokotroni is here, who is a great literary theorist, and her pedagogy, like many of my colleagues in so-called literary criticism, is theory-based. But Vasiliki is, you know, she went to Paris and interviewed Kristeva when she did her PhD at the Strathclyde, you know, so we're talking about serious theoretical engagement. And then we also have creative writing, which is more newly come, because, as you were acknowledging earlier, and I point out, you know, since the ref, and you know, you point out, since the ref, you know, we've got a place at the table, creative writing. But there's still this older Iowa model, which insists on a reductive kind of workshopping. I think of Ezra Pound's phrase, you know, there's a wonderful poem about the English where everybody in this English family is making some form of literature. And I can't remember, I think it's the brother is undergoing a novel. And there are lots of people who are undergoing a novel who mistakenly come to university. You know, university is a place of scholarship. So if you're going to undergo a novel, then you're going to undergo some reading of somebody else's novels. But you do have this resistance, I agree, Amit, that we're all going to workshop to death somebody's convincing neo-realist content-driven novel that may become a bestseller, and they want an agent, and they're resistant to all the reading and all the things that a university gives them access to, because they've drunk the Kool-Aid. They think that's what novel writing is. So yeah, I think there is some resistance to that in prose writing, but there's also incredibly exciting prose writing, like, for example, Schola von Reinhold's Lot. I mean, it's hard to know what kind of a text that is, in the same way as Orlando, you know, Virginia Woolf's Orlando. You know, I mean, it's very nice for me to be name-dropped in a novel, you know, but it's not happening in the literary criticism. And likewise, you know, what we find is stop getting people to mediate Derrida and Kristeva and the continental philosophers and thinkers, and just enable students to feel confident enough to read, even if it's in translation, as my French isn't good enough. But Derrida is a poet. Christopher is a poet. Helen Sisu is a poet. These theorists are poets, and they're, so it's no surprise to me that their ideas, and Sedgwick too. Sedgwick actually was a published poet, and so the major set theoretical reading I have on Poetry Mothers is everything Sedgwick ever wrote, basically. But it comes down to those two things that she analyzes, paranoid and reparative reading. And I think there has been a shift in the 21st century towards reparative. And when I was a tadpole doing my PhD, it was highly paranoid, combative, adversarial kind of seminar room behavior, often a boys' game, often falling on the sword of so-called bon mot and spiteful little attacks like Eagleton excels at. And interestingly, then in the 90s, I think the novel dominated. Everybody was undergoing a PhD on a novel. I never want to read another PhD on how Angela Carter has rewritten myth. I don't want to read it. I want to read a poem by my student or a short story by my student responding to Angela Carter. I do not want to read one of those god-awful essays that's, or Orlando, let's quote some Judith Butler quickly, who's mangling, Althusser and Derrida in order to come up with some crappy little, sorry, I'm being really rude about Judith Butler, so stop. But it's more the way the students then mediate that, and then, now we've all read Orlando, and that's what we're going to say. I want somebody to say, look at this sentence in Orlando. How can I write a sentence like that, and what's going on in it, So, but it's the creative writing people who build a community to make that happen in a way that I suspect at one point there was that kind of phatic community in lit-crit close reading encounters at their best. So, yeah, I think it's great. We've got all three, and certainly at Glasgow, there's a lot of strong feeling, but there's a space for all, and people do write genre fiction, content driven. Yeah, sorry, I've spoken enough already.
Okay, so do you want us to stop at this point?
There's a question there.
I'll have to preface this by saying that I've lived long enough in the American South that I found myself just humming along to your talk, because in a certain sense, in a very sort of radically spiritual, irreducible way, it was like being taken to church. But I want to hang on to this idea of the reparative and the restorative that you talk about. And in a certain sense, it's reparative and restorative because it restores and repairs the reduction of the irreducibility of being. And I was wondering if you see that as a potential within academic spaces and the Humanities Academy today.
I think that's the only reason I'm still in the academy, because it's a space of both otium and negotium, and it's our job, it's our job to keep that, to wedge open that space. I would take issue with any definition of the reparative, as I think Sedgwick understands it, as somehow restoring a totalizing plenitude or lost origin, unifying originary, but rather to encourage process and movement and subjects in process. And yeah, so I think that's our job, and that it's there are always those tensions, but the academy is not something to revile as a space that, we can all recognize that there are kind of business models that are getting in the way of what we want to do in the classroom, but nevertheless we persist. And, to answer your paper, I think that Eagleton is practicing a form of otium. It's the excess pleasure in what we do. It's when we become perfunctory and follow the HR minimum kind of contractual obligation of pedagogy or research scholarship. I mean, I've met colleagues on the steps of the library. Oh, what are you working on, I say. And instead of saying, I'm working on Virginia Woolf and Jean Toomer, they say, well, I'm writing an AHRC-funded essay on, blah. And you think, what? But that's it's sort of self-parody. So, yeah, but I think that's our job. And, I say to my students, don't tell them how much fun we're having. Don't tell them how we're apparently squandering time, enjoying ourselves. But to me, that's the hardest work of all, to do that in a meaningful way. I understand it as life. I don't understand it, as if there's this thing called life and then there's writing. I think, Virginia Woolf said this, I mean, she was an atheist, but she said in a beautiful essay, How to Read a Book, imagine, you're heading for the pearly gates. St. Peter turns to the archangel and says, oh, we don't need to worry about these people with their books under their arms, for they have been readers. We're already in heaven in that sense, in a material place of words, and we've still got stakes in it. So I think that's true, and I think that as soon as you get into this entrenched thing where you think that writing isn't making something happening, even criticism is making something happening. Even critics actually have a pleasure in words. They just sometimes need to be reminded of that.